All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the fifth episode of UK CORRAL. This is rescheduled from the fourth episode, but today we're going to be talking about Night Raven from Marvel Comics, and we'll get to that character in a minute. But as always, I'm joined by Adamantium. Hello, Adamantium. How are you? Yeah, not quite. Not quite. He cuts with his wit. Okay, also joining us is our newly christened Nice Man. Thanks for joining us, Nice Man.
Well, it's, what can I say? This is such a nice occasion, and it's just nice.
All right. And for those that, you know what? I bet you that if someone came into your moniker backward, they would, I don't know if most people could figure out who your, what character your name is a play on. So we'll leave that to the viewers, if they can figure out what your name is a play on, okay? But we'll get back to that later. But
we have a contest. Can we give an award to anyone who guesses it?
I don't know what the award would be. I don't know.
It would be Mike's Esteem.
A free Twitter account. There you go.
If we can get Twitter back, that would be incredible. That is a huge feat, and it's going to happen here in UK CORRAL. That's great.
There you go. Yep, we'll bring it back. Okay, so I guess my first question is, Paul, had you ever heard of Night Raven before we review the character for this episode?
I think very, very vaguely in the long distant past.
Okay. See, because the reason that I got this book is because originally it was in Alan Moore's bibliography. So I was super excited to get it. And then nothing against text, but I realized his stories were not comic books. They were text stories, which it makes me less excited. I'm still going to read them, but I want to read Alan Moore comics, right? But Adam, had you heard of this character before this episode?
No, I have had no exposure to this character up until this point, or so I thought, because I guess technically this character is also Nocturne.
Oh, I didn't know that. Who's Nocturne?
Some other hero who I'm vaguely familiar with. It's either that this character turned into Nocturne, or it was someone who took the mantle and eventually shifted into it. But it was a very strange thing, because that happened, I think, sometime within the late 90s or 2000s, where they took some of the UK exclusive characters and tried incorporating them into the 616 universe for North American publication. The character, I think, is still around technically, but not 100% sure. But as for Night Raven himself, we don't know who Night Raven is. Nope, this is my first exposure.
Well, to me, it makes sense. I mean, when you have stories by Alan Moore, it would make sense to bring this character into the 616, and then just print these reprint issues. Like, why not, right? Like, I think people would gobble them up. At least they would have in the 80s, I think, but we'll see.
You know what? I do want to say one thing. I'm going to correct myself, because people, in the comments, they're going to say, you don't know what you're talking about, Adamantium. And normally you're right. However, it was actually that this character, Night Raven, helped create a battlesuit that was donned by another character that became the hero, Nocturne.
Gotcha. Okay, so this character...
That's what it is, yeah.
So this character's probably lost to history, but that's okay. Cool design. I think after reading all the first 45 pages of this book, it's safe to say that this is kind of a shadow type, vigilante-ish type character, right? Pretty straightforward. These stories are very, very short. Most of them are only 3 pages long, right? 3 or 4 pages long, I think. So we are going to do our usual of summarizing these now. Because of our rescheduling and because of delays, it has been a solid 4 weeks since I've read these. And my memory is already horrible. So I hope you'll forgive me when I do my best. We can do some trade-offs here, but I'll do my best to try and summarize this first one, okay? And then we'll just go from here.
Well, I got a question for you, because I'm very curious to hear everyone's take on the character design before we actually get into the narrative.
Sure. Okay, let's talk about this cover. I personally think this costume is really cool. I mean, basic black with white straps, like I guess like 2 gun holsters, right? The white, not utility belt, but like a belt. The white mask. I think it's a great character. What do you think?
Paul, what's your opinion?
Okay.
Are you asking Nice Man or Adamantium?
Yeah. Okay, Nice Man, what do you think?
I think that's about the best thing about it.
Okay, the costume design. Okay. I can read between the lines there, but we'll leave it at that. Oh, by the way, we didn't mention the logo on his chest. I think the logo is pretty cool, although it looks exactly like his mask. So he basically has a picture of his face on his chest.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of weird.
Yeah, he's one of those university students that has a picture of himself on his T-shirt and he walks around with it because he's trying to be ironic. No, like the Night Owl design. You see, here's the thing. I'm calling him Night Owl already because it doesn't look like a raven. The mask is very owl-like, and that was
good point.
That was one thing that's been throwing me off a little bit. It's also interesting because I think the cover shows this character sans cloak, or well, it wasn't a cloak. It was a trench coat, and he had a hat on, which obscured his mask. But here you have the white symbol on the chest. You have the white sort of bandolier and the guns. Like, I think the cover is trying to impress upon the reader this is a Punisher-style villain. You have a lot of aesthetics similar to Punisher, but then when you get into it, you brought up the Shadow, and I do agree. I think aesthetically there's a lot of similarities with the Shadow. And while jokingly, yes, I mean, the mask doesn't really look like a raven. It looks more like an owl. It's effective. I do like the design. I prefer within the story how he's wearing the full trench coat and the hat to obscure the mask. And you know what? Anyone who can rock a black turtleneck, good stuff.
Sure. Okay. We should mention that this first batch of stories that we're reading are written by Steve Parkhouse, who I'm only familiar with from doing a Transformers story, but also doing some, I believe he did some work from Vertigo. And Paul, you had a story about Steve Parkhouse last week, right? Or last episode?
Yeah, but as always, I think everything has to come with a bit of context. Because I've seen Steve Parkhouse's art.
Okay.
And I like it. And so...
Me too.
I remember DC, some DC people flew over to Britain in the 80s and they met up with Alan Moore and Steve Parkhouse and all the others. And for some reason, the person who wrote the piece in the DC Comics in a particular month about the get-together thought it would be amusing to basically make fun of Steve Parkhouse.
Right.
I don't know why. You don't need to do that to anybody because he kept repeating throughout the piece that Steve Parkhouse was serious about working for DC. In other words, you could just picture Steve Parkhouse saying, I'm serious.
Sure.
I'm serious. I mean, he's just being earnest, and he's a good artist. But of all the people they met there, they didn't give him any work.
Interesting.
Which rubs it in even more, unless you know of a Steve Parkhouse DC piece that I don't know.
And I don't want to fiddle around with my screen because I'm recording it right now, but I believe he did do some work for Vertigo, but I could be wrong. But
well, I hope he did.
Yeah.
I know for sure he worked on some Doctor Who stories as well for writing, not so much doing the art, because I know actually there's a connection here. We'll get to the artist in just a moment with a very famous writer that he worked with, but he also worked with David Gibbons on some of those Doctor Who stories. And of course, the artist here, David Lloyd, of course, worked on V for Vendetta. So a lot of associates of Moore on this particular run. Also,
David Lloyd, who sends me a private message every year on my birthday to wish me a happy birthday. You too, Paul?
Yes.
Isn't that? Oh, I thought I was the only one. Whatever.
Well,
okay.
I'm just mincemeat. Gee.
Well, yeah, exactly. What are you, chopped liver?
I mean, the reason he does that is because he's a Taurus.
Oh, okay. I don't pay attention to the Zodiac. I think it's a bunch of bullshit, but whatever.
Oh, I get it. Before we get into it, let's mention one quick thing that despite the fact we have these creators here who are helming the art and the writing, neither created Night Raven. Night Raven was actually an editorial mandate by Des Skinn and Richard Burton. So just want to make it clear, this is not a creator helmed project. These are two artists,
hired
visual artists and writer assigned to it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna. Oh, go ahead, Paul.
Steve Parkhouse drew the Bojeffries Saga, written by Alan Moore,
which I own. I have never read though, but I do own it.
Yeah, nice art. So I was going to say, when I read that DC piece mocking Steve Parkhouse, I thought, well, why would you do that? He's a good artist, and I mean, I think I would have hired him to do some art,
Absolutely.
But having read Night Raven, I thought, oh, I not Steve to write.
I mean, I can only assume he was, he's obviously much younger here than he is now, but seems like the work of a younger person, definitely. But let's just talk about this first story here. Again, I'm going from hazy memory and from looking at the pages, but we open up with a very typical scene of some bad guys playing cards, and somehow they're unaware that one of the guys at the table is Night Raven, but with a hyphen. So he gives some of his shadowy dialogue. He flips the table. They try to shoot at him. He escapes the room. The one guy who's left over, he goes outside to the top of the building. He confronts Night Raven. Night Raven shoots him. Oh, no, sorry. What happens is they shoot him. The guy falls over, and when they unmask him, they realize it's actually the guy that they were playing cards with. So now they're all confused. Then they turn around, and then we see Night Raven in the costume he has on the cover. And he basically does his thing. He extends his hand, and I guess he burns something into their forehead, and we see that it's the Night Raven symbol. And then the cops show up. The end, 3 pages, where brooding darkness spreads its evil wings, the Night Raven stings. And so it's kind of like a little shadow, little ending, right? Like a little message for the cops. Very generic stuff. I hate to be harsh, but this is nothing that a teenager couldn't have written, I think. Like a very formulaic vigilante superhero story. Paul, we'll start with you, since you're such a fan. What did you think of this?
I feel sorry for Steve Parkhouse, because it was created by Des Skinn and Richard Burton, who I remember from my time in Britain, and David Lloyd with the art. And so they drafted in, Steve Parkhouse to write it. So I guess he wasn't necessarily vested in it, and he did what he could. But it's just one gigantic cliche, one awful, gigantic cliche. Zero characterization, zero. They're all cardboard cutout, one-dimensional characters, but not really characters. And at times I was laughing. It was so bad I was laughing. And I sound worse than the DC guy who was making fun of poor Steve Parkhouse. I know that. And it goes against my superhero name of Nice Man. I don't sound very nice right now. But here's one thing that I just like, oh, okay, all right. This is just absolutely too much. He's being kind of arrested, and he's got one hand pulled behind his back because they're going to put the handcuffs on him. And with no visual explanation whatsoever, no setup, nothing, we find that even though he's got his back to the arresting officer, even though one hand is already behind his back, he somehow manages to get the cuffs on the officer, so the officer is now cuffed. In addition to that, he's also managed to remove all the bullets from the officer's gun, or the arrest. And I thought, come on, just because you're saying, oh yes, and I got the bullets out too. It's like, come on.
You know what it's like? It's like, remember Jack Reacher?
Yes, but
the first movie was pretty good. The trailer for the second movie was horrible. I never watched it, but it's kind of the same thing. It's like this guy's in a room, and no matter if there's 2 guys or 10 guys, he's getting out, and the cuffs are going to be on you, and you're going to be in jail. And it's again, feels like it's written by a teenager who's watched 1,000 action movies, and he's copying the surface, but with no sense of logic. Adam, what do you think?
For me, just going on a general idea about these stories, like it would be parody if there was an intent to actually make the audience laugh or kind of deconstruct these tropes of these hard-boiled, like pulpy stories. But I am actually going to give a little bit of credit, because I think what happened was Des Skinn wanted a particular character that was a throwback to these 1930s pulp characters, such as the Spider, such as the Shadow, even going to like maybe the very early editions of how Batman was depicted. And so Parkhouse, he knew the assignment. I'm going to write this in that style and fulfill all the tropes, because that's exactly what my editor wants. And he did it. And you know what? For that, I think, I give him admiration for that. You know, he was able to do it to a T, but I don't know what the editorial mandate was at that point, but it seemed like he could not do anything more than that. He couldn't exploit it for humor. Me and Mike talked about Judge Dredd not too long ago and about how there's a great sense of sarcasm and a lot of play with tropes there. Here, there's no play with the tropes. It's just as is. The story is generic, and the only saving grace for me for this first issue is David Lloyd's art.
Don't say that. Because I have to, again, my God, it's so ironic that I'm absolutely the opposite of my superhero name today. The opposite. I should be disbarred.
So you don't think David Lloyd's art is good in this?
That's the worst David Lloyd art I've ever seen. It's sloppy. Oh, just so sloppy.
You know, okay, hold on. I do agree it's the worst David Lloyd art I've ever seen. But even on this first page, there is some creative use of shadow, right, and blacks, and I don't know. I don't think it's terrible. It's just by his standards, it's weak. You know,
well, he's so suited to something like For Vendetta. So suited for that.
Sure.
He's not suited for this.
Mm-hmm. I just think it's early in his career, and he's just not as good an artist. But the one thing I'll say though is that with all these short UK stories, the thing I like is it almost reminds me of like The Spirit, where you know, you get the Sunday funnies and you read Charlie Brown or Garfield. It'd be cool to read one of these a day or one of these a week, where you just pop it open, you read your 3 pages, and you're done, and you're on to the next one. I think that's what I like about these. They're so straightforward, whereas a lot of American comics at this time were so dense with thought balloons and exposition and footnotes to old continuity. So that's one thing I like about this.
I mean, you know.
Maybe I'm reaching, what is it called? I'm reaching.
No, you're looking for the glass half full, which is admirable. It's admirable.
Oh, thank you. Maybe I should be nice man instead of you. Anyway, okay, so how about this? You know, we got a lot of stories to talk about here. So why don't we jump to the next one? Adam, do you want to summarize the next one?
Oh, gladly. Let me do this. Okay, so Night Raven once again. You're going to hear a lot of this. There's shenanigans, a punch-up, and then Night Raven leaves his note behind. That's the Cliff Notes version. Basically, there is some sort of hold-up between mobsters and police. There is a visually impaired person tapping his cane. His cane gives off a sound like gunfire, so it intimidates the gangsters, who end up firing down on the ground from the building they're sequestered in at the police. Well, anyway, the police cannot enter into the building and stop this hostage situation where these gangsters are holed up in. However, we see Night Raven with a cane going tap, 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 but then he reduces the sound of it to make it sound like he's walking away, tricking the person inside of the building to go out and check and see if the coast is clear. It's not. Night Raven wallops him, and then the scene ends with him discarding the cane he was carrying and flicking some change to the visually impaired person. That's the story. I'm going to say this.
Do it.
This is go for it.
I'm going to say this is the best of all the comics that we've read today. Not of all time, please God, no. But
you mean of the ones we're going to read, or the 2 we've talked about so far?
Both, but
okay.
If only because, and I will argue in favor of David Lloyd's art, yes, it's not as tight as it would end up being, and I think a lot of that is also editorial mandate. You are trying to adhere to this thing. He's obviously trying to be somewhat Eisner-esque in his art here, because I'm sure that was the mandate given to him. With that said, though, the storytelling without any sort of dialogue, with just having the cane tapping on the ground, giving that sort of visual cue to the audience of the sound that's happening, how he's tricking the gangster, how he's diffusing this hostage situation. That was the sole creative thing that I've seen throughout this entire run of issues that we're going to talk about and that I've read of Night Raven. That, I thought, if we would have had more visually creative storytelling elements like that, it could have been at least something, which is why, to me, this was the strongest of the batch of stories. Beyond that, it's very generic, but at least there was a little bit of a twist, or I guess you could say a permutation of the storytelling with that use of unheard sound, I guess you could call it. That was my take on it, though.
Okay, Paul, what do you think?
I think you should banish me from this podcast.
Oh, no. Tell us the truth. Come on.
One after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. Cliches, cliches, cliches. Everything is a cliche. It became a blur of cliches. And so it was slog. It was tough to get through. And I told myself, okay, come on. You can do it. You can do it. And and that was it. The achievement was I made my way through it. But honestly, I just found every single episode just cliches on top of cliches. Cliches in story, cliches in speech, cliches in action. I'm sorry. It's one of the worst things I've ever read in my entire life.
Okay. Here's the thing. I'm going to say one more thing, glass half full. This art is actually already better than the first chapter. David Lloyd, who knows, maybe this is one of his first assignments, but he's already getting better. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, as I said, I think the biggest issue with his art in this entire run is it's very early, and I'm sure the mandate was to be Eisner-esque because you brought up the spirit, and that's definitely another touchstone of this. Now, I'm only going to make one argument against Iceman, Nice Man, Rice Man, whatever all should be called.
You gave away his reference, but anyway, go ahead.
Just bleep that out in the edit. But no, I do think this is the one that did something interesting because it was a dialogue-free story, and that was the only one that was it based in tropes? Absolutely, but I would hesitate to call this particular one completely cliched because of that. Because, even to this day, dialogue-free sequential comics and storytelling, it's very rare to see that. So I would make the argument solely for this particular iteration that there was something to it. But yeah, I do agree with Mike. I think the art's improved. Don't let me misrepresent myself. Is it great? No. But I think it is. I think it's still, I'll say this. Bad art by David Lloyd, not even bad art, but subpar art by David Lloyd is still exponentially better than the majority of graphic novel artists out there. I mean, it's nothing like what he's eventually going to get to for his work on Wasteland or Hellblazer or, of course, V for Vendetta, but still.
I agree. The other thing I want to point out is that now that I'm thinking about it, Larry Hama is very famous for doing one of the first, if not the first, wordless comic books, G.I. Joe number 21, Silent Interlude. This was before that issue, I believe. I don't know what the publication date is of this story, but it's very likely.
79. Sorry, Mike, 79, yeah.
So it's like 4 or 5 years before that Silent Interlude story. So, I mean, I know that there's precedence for that, like in it might have been Mad Magazine or Wallywood or something, but yeah, so that's pretty interesting, even if it's only 3 pages, and there are sound effects. I don't remember if Silent Interlude had sound effects, but still, it's pretty significant.
Maybe one day I'll look at it again.
Okay, there you go.
Maybe in reading the notes on it, Deskin is a real character, which is why, he was chosen to be the British Stan Lee.
Sure.
And Deskin hosted the first comic convention I ever attended.
Oh, yeah?
And I'll never forget, which reflects on his character, that we all, the audience was all there, and he was ahead of us, in a kind of stage area, and he said, I have here a copy of FF1. Ooh, FF1. And it was going to go to some lucky person, depending on what was done. And so it was dispatched to the lucky person. What was the catch, do you think?
It wasn't Fantastic Four #1.
What was it?
It was, I don't know, something else with F and F in the title.
Freedom Fighters #1.
Oh boy. Okay.
I thought, and even then, in a nice way, I thought, Deskin, you bastard. You really got people like me thinking it was actually FF #1 and I would want it. Freedom Fighters #1? No, you can keep it. So Deskin really created, again, to exonerate Steve Parkhouse. this is a whole Deskin drove all this creation of Night Raven, and it's almost like he's doing a Stanley impersonation. He wanted to, relive the pulps of the American 30s in Chicago, where characters would beat the crap out of the bad guys, he says, and so on. And he thought it was great that the Raven would leave a little note that says, "Where brooding darkness spreads its evil wings, the night raven stings." I like "In brightest day, in blackest light, blackest night, let no evil escape my sight." I like that one. This one, I'm thinking to myself, this is like third rate. The poor man's slogan.
Yes, I agree.
Spreads its evil wings, the night raven stings. And then I felt bad because he stole it. Who did he steal it from? Do you know?
No. Who did he steal it from?
And he admits that he stole it. He stole it from Milton, as in classic literature.
Really?
1600s. Stole from Milton from L'Allegro. And I thought, wow, Milton wrote that? That's
so
shit.
But the original quote could not have been Night Raven, was it?
No. I mean, and, well, again, it just simply says he thought it sounded a bit classical. It's stolen from Milton, from L'Allegro, but it sounds good. I thought it sounds really derivative and heavy.
It's not great. Well, it's just like, you remember The Thing, his quote was, "It's clobbering time," and that comes from Dante. So people are stealing from literature all the time. Anyway. Okay, so how about this? We got to jump on. We'll have plenty of offshoots and side stories as we go. But guess what, Paul? It's your turn to summarize one of these stories.
My God, I can't remember them.
Well, can you? Oh, and you can't see my feed here, eh? Oh, geez. Maybe this is impossible because we've got these. Adam, you've got it right up on your computer, right?
Well, how about we break convention a little bit, do something that this comic series certainly didn't do. How about we trade off and get some nice man commentary after each issue? I like that idea. Okay.
So we'll just summarize and he commentates.
Yes. Actually, Mike, I'm going to break convention further. I'm going to volunteer to read this next story.
Hey, go ahead. Sure. Go ahead.
Night Raven punches a guy. The end.
Yeah.
No, this one is a racketeer, the tax man. That's actually the name that they use for him, adding on to the bevy of cliches, who's going from business to business, strong-arming people to, of course, extort them.
Yes.
It ends up with an elderly gentleman who is punched out of a window by the tax man and his strong arm so hard that he not only breaks through the window, but is projected into a stray garbage bin on the street.
Yes.
You see, it's coming back to you. That's what they say about PTSD. Eventually you do relive it. But Night Raven is always a few steps behind. He's trying to figure out how he can prevent these extortionists from getting people to commit this racketeering. This, of course, leads to a bit of a punch-up, not only with mobsters, but after a misunderstanding with the police who see Night Raven trying to attempt the old man that was punched out of the window. They assume he attacked the old man. There's 2 panels of shenanigans between he and the police, and then it ends. Anyway, the next scene, the extortionists go to yet another business. This one is in the, it must be an Olive Garden because it's a delightful Italian stereotype happening here. But it ends with the proprietor of this restaurant basically telling the extortionists, "You cannot intimidate us. You leave now. This is our restaurant." They leave. The entire restaurant staff are complimenting the boss, but then they hear a ticking, of course, because they left a bomb behind, showing kind of the incompetence of Night Raven, because then he goes always one step behind the extortionist just in time for this building to explode, presumably killing everyone inside. So that's our hero for this story. That's where this issue ends.
And it's the cliffhanger, the first cliffhanger. Go ahead, Paul.
There is an aspect I like.
Oh, whoa. Okay.
This is rare. Go on.
The tax man is a kind of weedy-looking guy, right? He looks like a stereotypical tax man. But he comments that he doesn't like violence. So whenever, even though the strong man is there, the enforcer is there, and very violent things happen, he doesn't like it.
Mm-hmm.
He likes to distance himself. He doesn't really want to see it or hear it or experience it, but knows that it's happening. And I thought that's a nice little touch, I think.
Sure.
Because rather than both of them like, yeah, let's beat the crap out of this guy, he's like, well, it's just business, and you need to pay more, and that's it.
Okay, so you like that? Okay,
I like that.
No, and I agree. I do think that adds a slight extra dimension, and as with the previous issue, I think the art is fairly good on this one. I like the close-up here of this woman's face here. That's really nice. The page with the guy in the garbage can and Night Raven coming in, that's not bad. It's not spectacular. It's not David Lloyd's best work, but considering how condensed everything is, I do enjoy looking at this art. It's not bad.
I do understand that he is the master of the judo chop at this point, because he will be using that throughout the rest of these comics.
Yes.
I just want to bring up one more point before you go to the next issue, Mike. I think there's a bit of too muchness happening here, to coin a phrase, which is not only does Night Raven seem to have kind of conflicting costumes. He has the trench coat, which is evoking the spirit, obviously, or the shadow, but he also has the full mask and he has the insignia on his chest. So already I think there's a lot of conflicting stuff happening for his design. He has both the note that he leaves behind and the mark that he cast on the faces of his enemy. So why would you need both? It seems like if you need a telltale sign that Night Raven was there, you should just use one or the other. It just feels like maybe, I don't know, maybe the editorial team said, oh, we can't decide which idea we like better. Just use both of them.
Well, yeah, it's also a little bit of like kind of just making it up as you go along. Instead of planning out all these things before you publish the first story, you kind of just like, okay, let's try this, right? That's also what could have happened.
But then we get to the scene, and you're going to be recounting this, and I believe this is the one Paul already referred to, the great escape from Night Raven from the police officer.
Oh, in the next issue, yes. Trapped by the police, the mystery man known only as Night Raven. So here he is. He's trapped by a police officer. The police officer has him up against the wall, but then somehow, is this where it happens? It's hard to see because my screen is so small, but we hear a click. And then all of a sudden, Night Raven walks away. Well, if you won't be needing me anymore, I'll say goodnight. Hey, what the? How? Wait a minute, I don't. Yeah, so now the handcuffs are on him. And he's like, hold it, I'll blast you. He says, I doubt it. You see, I took the precaution of removing the bullets. Click, click, click. Hey, man, Paul, this guy's fast. What can I say? He's fast, right? Anyway, so,
right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Is it really the Flash? Is that what it is?
I'm sorry.
So then we cut over to the shop of old Albert Feldstein, the clockmaker, and someone's knocking at his back door, so he goes back there. And this is the gang. This is the Taxman's gang, right? And so then they tie him up, and they've got him locked up in a room. And no. You see. Yes. Go ahead, Adam. Go ahead.
They meet him, but then Night Owl intervenes later on. He does save him, but also what he does is he dresses up as the proprietor of this shop. He actually has tied up the shop owner in the back as he's in disguise to beat up the bad guys, which is, again, not only is he a vigilante who murders indiscriminately, but he also ties up old men. Anyway, go on.
So they look in the back like, what's this? What's that out back? So they see the real guy, Feldstein. If you're back here, then who's out there? Good question. We cut back, and now we see Night Raven disguised as Feldstein doing his judo karate chops. Crunch, rock, thwop, crash, right? And then the taxman's like, oh my God, that sounds like sordid physical violence, like Paul mentioned earlier. So he jumps in his car, and then as he's driving away, he's like, oh, that clock is a very loud tick. This is the clock that he took from the watchmaker. And then, of course, it ends up being a bomb. The car explodes, goes over the edge, and falls into the river. And then we see his hat floating. And then, of course, we see the note, where brooding darkness spreads its evil wings, the Night Raven stings. More adventures of our Man of Mystery next week, and I'll be back for more. What about you, Paul?
I'm sorry, I'm sure I have to do something masochistic.
You what?
I said, I'm sure I have to do something masochistic, but preferably less masochistic.
Are you gonna? So do it.
But I was going to say in one of these asides, because whenever we cover stuff, between us, we have like knowledge of comics and decades and writers, and sometimes there are some pertinent asides.
Sure.
And now, as much as we love Jack Kirby,
okay,
and deservedly the king of comics.
Yep.
There are also valid criticisms of some of his work, because nobody's perfect. And Steve Englehart once remarked that one problem with Jack Kirby's writing is that he doesn't necessarily establish beforehand that something can be done and then it's done. A character will suddenly pull like a rabbit out of a hat.
Sure.
It hasn't been established beforehand that the character can do this, or it's capable, or whatever else. And so when I saw our Night Raven with his back to the arresting officer and one arm already behind his back and one wrist already with the handcuff on, and then suddenly the arresting officer is handcuffed completely and the bullets have all been removed from his gun, it made me think of what Steve Englehart said about Jack Kirby.
Mm-hmm.
Night Raven, this hasn't been established. It hasn't been established.
Okay.
They just pulled it out of nowhere.
But here's the thing I'm going to argue is that this is not a superhuman ability. It just shows that he's quick and he's the hand is quicker than the eye and he's sneaky. So I don't think there's how could you possibly introduce this idea like in a subtle way? Like, go ahead, Adam. You know how? Okay.
Batman.
What do you mean?
Batman's already just established he's someone who has training. He's someone who has learned tactics to take down, implement all sorts of non-lethal force against his foes. And even early on in the initial run of comics, yes, while he did exact a lot of violence against people, there was still some, passing dialogue where people commented, oh, he must have trained for years. This is some sort of form of martial arts that he's practicing. Like little cues to the reader that, oh, there are indications something's going on here beyond just he out of nowhere can pull this out. I think even in those early Batman comics, there was, a lot of people asking why the character can do this and that. And then the writers went about and said, oh, because of this and that. And they integrated it into the story. I'm going to agree with Paul. There's no integration of that into here.
So this is kind of a Batman-esque character, but with no explanation for training or year or anything.
Or characterization or motivation or great design or, characters you care about or et cetera, et cetera.
That's true. So far, we haven't seen anything beyond all the cool stuff that he can do. Nothing else.
Right.
Okay.
Steve from Parkhouse maybe he said, well, what do you want me to do? I had like 3 pages a week or something like this. And Deskin wants action. I don't blame Steve Parkhouse for this. I blame Deskin.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
1 point for Paul. Okay, next story. So now, Adam, is it your turn or is it my turn? I think it's your turn.
It's my turn. This is technically a 2-parter, and I think just for the sake of brevity, do you mind if I just go through parts 1 and 2? Because essentially,
anyway.
Yeah, I mean, this is just going to be a very quick story. Essentially, what we have is a gambler named Ace Diamond who's in a pool hall. He's seen as cheating at cards, and there's a punch-up that erupts in the bar. But of course, behind a pool table is Night Raven. He does some cool stuff, including, hitting a cube across a pool table, knocking someone with a ball in the head with this shot. more fighting ensues, and it ends up with Ace, the person who was cheating at the card game, running out, locking the door, leaving Night Raven behind to be attacked by people within the pool hall. Next story, picks up from that beat. Guess what? The guy who beat up a bunch of people in the pool hall continues to beat up a bunch of people in the pool hall. So that ends. Essentially what happens thereafter is that Ace decides that he has all this money that he's managed to take from said card game from earlier, that he has a hankering to just gamble it all. He needs a big card game to go to, so he gets a note slipped under his door. Miraculously, we all know it's Night Raven giving him this note, but even though Night Raven has tracked him down, he doesn't just do anything right away. He plays this game with him where he gives him a note telling him to come to such and such a location for this card game. We have, intersplicing section with police officers also being given notes saying where Ace is going to be. And then we cut to the scene where Ace goes to the location on the note he was given. The door opens, and then he sees a bunch of gamblers around the table, dead, with Night Raven's insignia burnt into their heads. Night Raven closes the door. He led them there. He plays a little game, and the only somewhat clever thing about the story is that initially, in the first part of the story, in the previous issue, it was seen that Ace was cheating by having cards up his sleeve. Here, there's a rigged game where Night Raven sits down to play poker with him, but he has a deck of cards that has his insignia plastered all over it. He wins the game, and at that point, Ace goes to pull a gun but fails to shoot him. Night Raven burns his insignia into his face, and then the bodies are there for the police to find thereafter, and that's that.
And it's quite cool, and I really liked it. No, I didn't love it.
Nothing like indiscriminate murder, of course.
Yeah. But again, the art is getting incrementally better. I did like the art in this one. It was very fluid. As I'm flipping through the pages here, some nice use of black, some nice action, like this shot of him jumping down on the ground, and then the next row of panels, we see him hitting the guy over the head with a pool cue. It's very nice. It's very fluid. However, Paul, I got a feeling you do not feel the same way. What did you think of this two-parter?
The same as all the others.
Yikes. Okay. So nothing to add. There was nothing clever about this one. Did you like the deck of cards? Look at that. He's got his own deck of cards with his logo on it. Don't you like that?
Well, I mean, like Adam was saying, come on. You get a note under the door inviting you to a card game, and come on. You're going to go to this card game?
I would go, yes.
Oh,
I can't turn down an invitation like that,
There's a PS under it. It says, "You will definitely not be murdered."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
this is my thing about Night Raven as a character, and I not to derail the conversation any more than it's already been, but he's not a good character, and I don't mean like in terms of well executed. I mean morally, he's not a good character. Like, all he had to do, since he knew where Ace Diamond lived, was either get the police to go to his place, or he could just beat him up if that's what he was going to do. Instead, he plays this game. He sends him to this room. He has this huge ruse. It's like a cat and mouse game with no other purpose than him torturing this person and then ending with his murder. And that's, I keep saying this offhandedly, but I have a thing against heroes that indiscriminately murder. It's a thing that I have an aversion against. I think some characters, it fits their characterization. Night Raven, as per the points made by our nice man over here, there is no indication why he's indiscriminately murdering. There's people who have been killers, who have been extortionists, and this guy obviously just has a gambling problem, and yet he kills them all as if they were equally unjust. And
I'm sorry, but it's a perfect jumping in point. Mm-hmm. So Derskin wants a throwback to the 30s, right? And we know from the earliest Batman would just kill indiscriminately. Mm-hmm. I always remember, not that I was there, at the beginning, like 1939, 1940, whenever, and he would like thump somebody over a rail into a vat of boiling oil, and the character would die. And I always remember the dialogue says, "A fitting end for your kind."
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, you know, what Night Raven does is not too different from what the original Batman used to do, and kill somewhat indiscriminately and just say, "Hey, well, you know, tough." But I wanted to say that in my opinion, the only way you can do such a character who kills indiscriminately is with your, you know, the expression tongue in cheek, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Tongue in cheek, and that's what Garth Ennis did in The Punisher with Steve Dillon.
Yes. Yes.
When they did The Punisher, that's exactly the way to do The Punisher. It's the only way you can do The Punisher, the only way, so that his body count is a kind of comedic, you know? But there's no hint of this in Night Raven because there isn't the space, there isn't the time. There's just no hint of it. So what Adam says is justified. That, wow, you know, this guy's actually like a bit sadistic, a bit immoral. And somebody could say, yes, but so is the Punisher. Well, not the Garth Ennis, Steve Dillon Punisher. No, because that's a tongue-in-cheek scenario and a tongue-in-cheek character. And that way you can get away with it. And somebody could say, yes, well, Batman was at the beginning. Yeah, I guess he was, and that was around 1939, 1940, and this is supposed to be Chicago like 1930, so that's the only saving grace, Adam, I think of it. It's not like a 1970s indiscriminate killer.
No, and I do agree with you on that. I think the analogy you brought up for those early Batman issues, I think that's probably the closest we'll get to it. You know, I'd be interested to even go to some of those early issues, though, and see just exactly what type of criminals Batman was just murdering or let die, because it seemed to me it was a lot more strong-arm types for mobsters or for gangsters. Regardless of that, I don't want to speak to it because I don't have the full story. I agree. And in fact, when I talked about how I think you can only do this character who indiscriminately murders a certain way, that Punisher run was the first thing that came to my mind. So I'm glad you brought it up. I brought up Judge Dredd, and maybe we'll talk about that character later on. But I think also with using tongue-in-cheek and a lot of parody, that also applies to that. But, you know, it's interesting because now we're going from this, and Mike, I don't know if you want to take on the burden, but we just don't have a multi-part story. We have a whole arc with this one.
If you would like to summarize, feel free, because, again, my memory is so terrible. So, Adam, if you want to, go ahead.
Wow, okay. I apologize for everyone who has to hear me so much.
No, go ahead.
So this takes place over, it's either 4 or 5 issues. And the basic setup is now after weeks and weeks of Night Raven accosting people in this pseudo-Chicagoan city, now the big mobs, they want to have a hit on this individual, on Night Raven. So Mr. Big, who is a wheelchair-bound mob boss, hires an assassin to do a hit on Night Raven. The assassin, he is not one for creative names. He's simply titled The Assassin. So we go forward in the story with The Assassin. Yeah. Before we go on, like, do you think there's anything to just calling this character Assassin, or is it just complete laziness? I
think it's laziness because I've done it myself. I think it's complete laziness. Also, Mr. Big, also a lazy name, right? Mm-hmm. So is the Kingpin, but now the Kingpin, it's so old that it's become kind of classic in its own right. But at the time, it was just like, oh well, we call all of our mob bosses Kingpins or Mr. Big or whatever. So let's just use that. But as we're, but anyway, yeah, I just think it's laziness.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead. No, that's it. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to speed through the rest of this telling.
Sure.
Basically, this is interspliced with the police trying to figure out who Night Raven could possibly be. So there is a detective that goes out trying to investigate the possible origin and name of who Night Raven can be. Story cuts to a person who's drunkenly wandering down an alleyway who gets the shit beat out of him by some muckers. Luckily, of course, by pure serendipity, there happens to be Night Raven in the alley who beats up these guys, again interspersed with scenes of the police doing investigations to try to determine Night Raven's identity. Well, as Night Raven is about to leave after supposedly saving this drunkard, he takes off his mask and pulls out his gun saying, "You'll see I'll get the rest of this money after I've killed you," because he reveals himself in that moment as the assassin. So very poor choice, I just want to say, taking off your mask after pointing your gun at somebody and just not killing them immediately.
Mm-hmm.
It leads immediately to the next story, picking up from there. So we have a big ensuing fight between the assassin and Night Raven, but there is a detective. Detective Christopher Nolan, as I like to call him, comes down the alleyway to investigate some shenanigans going on, and he sees that there is about to be a punch-up between these two. He wants to intervene, including after Night Raven punches out the assassin to arrest Night Raven, but a scuffle ensues. Christopher Nolan gets shot in the shoulder, so he's not making Inception anytime soon. More of a punch-up between Night Raven and Assassin. Night Raven, as per my theory of him being yet another derivative of Batman, pulls out a grappling hook gun to scale a wall after the assassin basically parkours up these fire escape steps. And I do have to say, there's one moment where the assassin flings himself from one fire escape to another, and there's this pause where Night Raven just looks at him as if, "That's supposed to be my thing. Why are you doing that?" That was one that made me chuckle slightly. But as he's about to use his grappling hook and swing over, the assassin throws out a knife, severing the cord, leaving Night Raven to plummet to his doom, or so we think. In the next issue, of course, there is a jib with a rope that's stationed on the side of a building that he's able to take the remnants of his cord around from the grappling hook, saving himself. There just happens to be mobster activity in that alley right beneath him. It's a very busy alley because this is just a few feet away from where the cop was shot. So everything's going down here this night. Anyway, there's a lot of text letting you know this is happening in the 30s and Prohibition. So they're trying to basically take alcohol and send it off to be sold. And again, lots of text blocks reminding you this is illegal. That's why these people are trying to sell this illicit booze. Anyway, more punch up. The gangsters are taken care of. The cop, his name is actually Officer Nolan, but he awakens from his gunshot. He sniffs the illegal booze that's been smashed against the ground, and he goes to phone for reinforcements. During this time, the people who are trying to traffic the illegal booze are still fighting with Night Raven, who, of course, effortlessly defeats them, only for the assassin to pop right back up. And in the next issue, continue their scuffle again, flinging themselves from rooftop to rooftop. They're crashing through windows. And the window that they happen to crash through, which is a building right next to the police station where Officer Nolan came out of, happens to have the speakeasy with Mr. Big in there with his entire gang. And seeing Night Raven just crash through the window, they all pull out their arms. They're about to fire at him. Of course, Night Raven does the only thing he can do when he sees a gigantic novelty chandelier on the ceiling, throws his own knife. It shatters, scattering the criminals, while, again, remember, Officer Nolan phoned for backup. All the cops are coming right around the corner for this big dust-up. And it ends in one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen, and I will admit, this is one of the few really amusing parts of this graphic novel comic strip run. Mr. Big is, as I mentioned, wheelchair bound, and he usually has someone pushing him around. Night Raven goes behind him and starts pushing him out the exit. And he's just in awe of the fact that Mr. Big doesn't even realize that it's him pushing him. So, of course, he's doing this so he can either arrest him or beat him up. But then as he's exiting the building with Mr. Big in tow, the assassin pops back up, continues scuffling with Night Raven. But there's such a steep incline that uncontrollably, Mr. Big in his wheelchair goes shooting down this street uncontrollably at like top velocity. And luckily, underneath his little blanket covering his legs, he has a Tommy gun at the sight of the police at the very bottom of this steep hill. He just fires, higgly-piggly at them, ending this. And this is the final part of this story. It picks up again. here's this wheelchair-bound man just firing a Tommy gun at all these police officers as he's speeding through. But of course, he can't control his speed, and he ends up being collided with by a big truck, and the truck crushes him and kills him. It cuts back to the fight between Night Raven and Assassin. Of course, Night Raven gets the better of his adversary, even leaving the mark of the Raven on his head. And then cuts back into the speakeasy where there is a confrontation with officers that are investigating and the remnants of the gang that were there. A shoot-up ensues, but it ends with a big shootout when police officers hear somebody at the door. They just randomly open fire. So, the police officers are no better in this world either. And out comes the assassin with the mark of Night Raven on his head and the note, of course, on his body. The police have riddled him with bullets, and that ends that whole thing.
Okay, the first thing I've got to say, and even Paul, you've got to admit this, I think the art is getting a lot better.
I do, I like David Lloyd art very much, and David Lloyd is a great artist. So, and of course, this is very early on, 1979. So, we can't expect the same as 10 years later or something. So, I don't disagree with you. I think inch by inch, it's getting better.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, like, now what we're seeing is a more, like, if you go to the first couple stories, the camera's kind of always right here. The figures are always like this. In this story, the camera's moving around. It's getting higher angles, lower angles, closer, farther. The page that I'm on right now, very fluid action. The characters are going in different directions. Here we see a character flying towards the reader and kicking Night Raven in the face, So I think he's developing very quickly as he goes along. And so, at least for the art, I think this has been the best one so far. I think the story is okay, as usual. They're all kind of okay, but this one has a little bit more room to breathe because it's a multi-part story, right? So I guess it's safe to say this might be the best one yet, which isn't saying much, but still, I think it's pretty good.
My only caveat with this is there is a point at the very beginning of this arc where it's promising the reader that they're going to figure out the identity of Night Raven.
Right.
Does this happen? It
does not. It does not happen.
Right. Yeah, I was really bummed.
You seem devastated.
It's Night Raven. Who?
Okay, so I guess that's all you have to say about that one, eh, Paul? What do you think of the story? Anything?
No.
Okay, that's it. Thank you, Paul.
I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry.
I hope this episode was worth the build-up of 4 weeks, because that's how long we've been waiting to do this one. But anyway, okay, so we're going to jump on to the next one. Paul, Adam, would you like me to do this one, or do you want to do this one too?
This is the final arc, and it's the final 3 issues we're covering. So, Mike, if you would like to, I had to do wheelchair Tommy gun, so I think you can do this one.
Oh boy. Okay. Again, forgive my memory, but let's try to figure out what's going on here. So basically, so this guy, who is this? The editor for the newspaper, right? Like the editor in chief. He wants to get a scoop on the Night Raven, so he sends a reporter out to do a story on him, right?
Mm-hmm. And the reporter's name is Scoop.
Let's see, again, very creative use of names here, right? We got Mr. Big, we got Scoop. What was the other one? Assassin. Very creative, yeah. So later that night, Scoop finds himself outside a small hotel in a seedy, rundown part of town, right? So he's going to figure out anything he can about Night Raven, right? So then he, again, this is all coming from my hazy memory. I'm looking at the pages now. But so we get a little caption here. The first steps into the murky depths of the city's underworld, where many men have stumbled and so few men have returned. Now, I got to say, I can't talk about this without talking about the art. This is very cool art. It's almost German expressionism, right? Like, look at the stairway that he's running down, and like the silhouette in the doorway. I'm liking this stuff. This is solid, Again, not as good as V for Vendetta, but it's solid.
I will say, Mike, because just to intervene, the panels are akimbo. Every other sequence, the panels are overlapping or they are perfectly angular. Here, they're at angles, which shows what you're about to reveal as the little twist of this whole sequence. But I just want to say that is a nice touch I want to give to David Lloyd for this.
Yeah, exactly. So again, he's getting better. He's getting more creative. And so, oh geez, sorry, this is hard to read because usually I'm used to a screen this big. But
well, I think Paul's been saying this has been hard to read from the get-go.
Yeah, that's true. So basically what happens is we do find out that this is a dream sequence. And it almost reminds me of like what was the Hitchcock movie Spellbound, where we had a little bit of Salvador Dali imagery with Gregory Peck running in slow motion, like down a hill, like a giant eyeball. Like that's kind of what they're going for here. That kind of
Mike,
feel.
with your comment, I can hear both Dali and Gregory Peck rolling around in their graves right now, like lathes. But anyway,
just like Dante and everybody else. That's fine. So anyway,
in Milton.
Yes. Yeah, in Milton. Yeah. So anyway, so we get this nice giant shot of in the dream of a giant actual night raven coming and swooping in and picking up Scoop. Oh, I think it's great. But he wakes up and realizes, okay, it was just a nightmare. So he's like, but wait a minute, I did hear a scream from downstairs. So then he grabs his camera and he goes to the stairway and he looks and there's some toughs who are trying to hustle this guy, right? And he's like, you heard what the man said. Hand over your takings or I'll ventilate your vest, right? And then look at this creative art. He pulls out his camera and we see through his viewfinder, we see one of the toughs, but then coming in behind him, we see Night Raven to save the day. Now we got to wait a full week to find out what happens next. So then we skip to the next issue. Wait a sec here. Did I go backwards? I went backwards. So we go to, wait, did I? What happened? I just skipped an entire issue. Okay. So then in the next issue, now we see the Punch Out with the bad guy and Night Raven. And and then the bad guy goes up and he ends up grabbing Scoop, right? Is that what happens here?
Mm-hmm.
He takes Scoop as a hostage and they throw Scoop into the back of a car. Again, this issue is so short. There was actually no beginning. It just started. So it was hard to, I actually skipped around the wrong way. So they throw him into the back of a car. They drive away and then they're being followed by Night Raven. Is that Night Raven in another car? No, it is that a cop or is that Night Raven? It is Night Raven.
It is Night Raven, yeah.
And then a cop joins the fray, right? A cop on a motorcycle joins the fray and he pulls up beside the bad guy. And he's thinking, I know that face from somewhere. Okay, Mac, where's the fire? By the way, I never understood that cliche, where's the fire? If there was a fire, why would someone be speeding down the road to get to it? I don't get that.
No, you're going away from it, Mike.
Sure, I still don't get that. It's like you go 5 feet and you're away from the fire. Anyway, okay. So then the guy's like, I don't know if I can, officer. Just keep going, newsboy, or I'll spread your brains all over the highway. So this is Scoop, and the bad guy's in the back telling him what to say to the cop. He's like, oh, Lord, what do I do now? How's he going to get out of this one? We have to read next issue's story to find out, right? So then we go to the next issue, and now the bad guy decides to pull a gun on the cop. He shoots him, right? And now the Scoop guy feels kind of bad about that because that happened. And then Night Raven is still chasing in his car, and we have to remind our readers, or our listeners, this is set in Prohibition times, right? So he's chasing after him, and now there's a big shootout, and the bad guy's car ends up flying off the road. So now is this the bad guy or is this Scoop? Yeah, Scoop fell on stony ground. So Scoop is amongst the wreckage of the car. He gets the money that was taken by the bad guys. He grabs it all up and he takes off. He's like, okay, so what am I going to do now, right? So then he goes back to where's he going here, Adam? Do you remember?
Well, basically, he's just running because he has money.
Oh, okay.
Night Raven stops him because, basically, no, you can't run away with money. And it implies that he's about to sting him with his insignia. But then, of course, Scoop wakes up and he sees, no, he just left a message on the door right behind me. And there are the bodies of the two people that were trying to abduct him. There's his little note, as always. And it ends with Scoop having published a story titled I Was Near Victim of Night Raven. Obviously, he doesn't believe in proper grammar for the byline. But regardless, he peers out the window just thinking, don't worry, Chief. Someday I'll find out who he is. And maybe even someday I'll get to thank him. And that mercifully ends Night Raven for us.
However,
Uh-oh.
at the very end, it says next issue or something, a new direction for Night Raven.
A great new direction for Night Raven, yes. And if I can just cut away for a second from my screen, that's because starting with the next issue, the writer is now going to be Alan McKenzie. And then there's various artists, including Jim Steranko, John Bolton, Paul Neary, and Alan Davis. So you know what? I don't know what to say. I'm going to have to keep reading after this. I don't know about you guys, but I'm going to keep going.
Well, you're very bold, Mike. I think this concludes. I believe this only ever ran as a backup for Hulk comic in the UK.
Yes.
Well, but starting in the next issue, it did jump to Savage Action. And then when it started with the tech stories, it went to Marvel Superheroes and the Daredevils and the Mighty World of Marvel. So
okay, I
jump
see.
around a bit, yeah. So there you go. That's Night Raven. So Paul, do you have any more with that story we just read? Do you have anything else to say? Has this story won you over or no?
I'm speechless.
You're speechless. Okay. So it didn't get any better then.
No. I mean, it was all much the same thing. Again, for me, the news guy, Scoop, and of course, in the end, Night Raven knew that Scoop was innocent, and therefore Scoop didn't end up dead. Perhaps it would have been more fun if Scoop had ended up dead.
I don't know. I do like the idea of him kind of being scared that Night Raven's going to kill him and that he spares him. But it is a little bit too close for comfort, right? Like, I mean, how ruthless can Night Raven possibly be? But what did you think, Adam?
I want to go off of Paul's point because I think that's very interesting. I've already established a little bit of antipathy towards this character because he, indiscriminately murders. What's the difference between Scoop and anybody else? You could argue maybe he was aware that Scoop was a reporter and he would give some publicity about him. But, there's no other indication throughout the run of the comic that he had a motivation for it. It just seems like an inconsistency. And, when you have a character whose sole behavior is this predictable, it's very glaring when something like that happens. I actually agree. I think it would have been kind of interesting if it would have been, oh, sorry, you did do this morally unethical thing. Therefore, you're not exempt from my form of justice. You're also going to be murdered by me. At least then we see how ruthless Night Raven would be. But by doing this, they reel back too much. And the one thing that could have made it a little bit more interesting, I think they diffused it. This is B-grade Batman, and I feel like there is a conflict happening here, that it feels in some ways like it's written for children.
Yeah, I agree.
But in another way is so violent and is so murderous that it seems inappropriate for children at the same time. So it's in this weird interzone where I can't really make heads or tails of who exactly this is for, aside from Dez.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah, it's for Dez. This is Dezkin's baby, and that's it. And I think if I like characters like you two, I'm sure, to be authentic. And what does that mean? Well, for me, Rorschach is an authentic character. I'm totally convinced by everything he does and says. But, again, I think we have to be fair. These are little snippets of story, and there really maybe wasn't time, wasn't space. If Steve Parkhouse could be here now, I think he'd probably give us, tell us more about what was going on then, and we'd be in total sympathy with him and total understanding, really.
I do agree with you, Paul, and I agree with, I think, a lot of sentiments people have had about this comic over the years from just what I've read about it. It's that no one tends to think it's great, but I think people will say the writers and artists did an admirable job with the very strict mandate that they had. And, this is a pastiche of Batman comics, Dick Tracy strips, The Spirit, The Shadow, you name it. But with that said, I will say that I will disagree slightly. I do like the art here. It's not the best, but I still think it's admirable. I think it shows the trajectory that eventually we're going to see come to flourish in a few years by David Lloyd. And, Parkhouse, it's a very unfortunate gig that he had, but I will say he did the job that he was set out to do. And I think this is just kind of a warning for the comics medium in general. You don't always get to work with what you want. You have to work with what you're assigned. And, I've seen so many talented writers and artists work on subpar stories and runs because it's essentially they know what they have to do to make a living. With that said, it's not great. It's an interesting little oddity, but I could not recommend this to anyone. I think if you want something like this, read Eisner, read like the old Batman comics, and maybe because Alan Moore did write some prose stories of this character.
Yes.
I wonder how much characterization and how much depth he would have given for those prose stories. So I would be interested in reading those, but I can't recommend this comic run, unfortunately.
Because I am a completist and I think there's only maybe 20 pages more of actual comics, I'll probably finish that. And then I'll definitely read the Alan Moore stuff because I love Alan Moore and I read everything he does. And I am curious to see how he expands on the mythology of this character. So I guess my last question for Paul is, Paul, are you going to read the Alan Moore stuff for Night Raven?
I love Alan Moore stuff. I do, but it's not on my to-do list, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I mean, there are only so many hours in the day.
Okay. Well, luckily we spent about 3 hours reading this and an hour and a half reviewing it. But anyway, sorry, were you going to say something, Adam?
I was just going to say, I don't think I'm going to get to the Alan Moore stories anytime soon. I still haven't even read his 1,000 plus page novel yet. So, there's a lot to get through. I will say, though, if people like this sort of concept, but they're wary about the execution, I did bring up Eisner's work with The Spirit, which you can get in all sorts of digest forms. And I think, I have some criticisms over the original Spirit. The art is impeccable. Like, the stories are based on a lot of cliche and tropes, but it's enjoyable. You get some characterization. I would say if you're intrigued by the type of setting, but like us, you felt a little bit put off by the execution, pursue that stuff. That is going to be what you should be reading instead of this.
I agree with that. But I am still going to go forward. However, speaking of Alan Moore, our next episode of UK Corral will be none other than Alan Moore's entries for Star Wars in the UK. Paul, you don't look excited. Paul, come on, help me out here. You love Alan Moore.
I think I'm going to be fired.
No. You've read them, you don't like them.
No, I'm not a fan of Star Wars.
Oh my God. Okay, you know what? Save your comments. Are you willing to join us to review Alan Moore Star Wars? There's only about 5
I mean, if anyone can make Star Wars interesting, it would be Alan Moore. I'm more of a Blade Runner, alien type sci-fi fan. I'm Star Wars, it's not for me.
Okay, we'll talk more about that on our next episode. And like I said, there's only about 5 stories, so it'll be much shorter than this episode. But be sure to join us next week. It's going to be a good one. I want to thank Adamantium and Nice Man, the newly christened Nice Man, for joining me this week. Yeah. And hopefully you'll be back next week. And be sure to join us every 2 weeks for UK Corral. And in between, join us for Taped Crusaders and Laser Brains. And that's on the comicbooksyndicate.com and the Comic Book Syndicate on YouTube. So we will see you all next time. Goodbye.